Ted Cruz, the legendarily unlikable part-time Republican congressman and full-time podcaster, is visibly panicking over two facts. Number one, his Democratic challenger for the Texas Senate seat is vastly outperforming him in fundraising. And number two, there is a potential ethics scandal involving his PAC and the podcast that he won't shut up about. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, we haven't done a video about Ted Cruz in a while, mostly because I don't want to make you nauseous. I don't want to make myself nauseous, but we got to talk about this. Number one, because the Senate map for Democrats this year is very tough. It's going to be a hard map. Right now, we are in the majority just by a couple of seats. Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, is retiring. He's not seeking re-election, which means we will lose that seat. We are not going to elect a Democrat in West Virginia. And so we've got to defend all of our races where we have incumbents. But if we want to expand our majority, we need to flip a couple of seats. And believe it or not, Texas is seen by Democratic experts as the best bet that we've got. So we are pouring a ton of money to try to defeat Ted Cruz in Texas. And Colin Allred, a Democratic congressman, is looking to replace him. He's a former NFL player. He's a sitting member of the House of Representatives, and he's looking to replace Cruz. So with all of that in mind, this is Cruz low-key freaking out over how well Allred is fundraising.
My opponent, a liberal Democrat named Colin Allred, is outraising Beto O'Rourke, my last opponent, 3-1. They are flooding millions of dollars into Texas, and the reason is simple. You remember my last reelect? It was a 3-point race. I won by 2.6%. And so Chuck Schumer, his view is he floods millions into Texas, he gains 3 points, and that's how they win.
So again, he's right in the sense that Democratic leader Chuck Schumer believes that Cruz's seat is the most vulnerable to being flipped by the Democrats. Now, Allred was recently interviewed by The Daily Show. There was a fun exchange here in which The Daily Show host basically asks Congressman Allred, Cruz's challenger, to talk about the most embarrassing things about Ted Cruz, because the list is long.
You have such an interesting resume. You're a former NFL player, civil rights attorney, congressman, and now currently running against Ted Cruz.
That's right.
For the You have said before that Texas doesn't have to be embarrassed by their senator. What is the most embarrassing thing about Ted Cruz? Is it that he fled to Cancun while Texans were in the dark and cold, or that time that he didn't feel the booger on his lip for so long? Burned in my memory.
You know, I think there's the antics, right? There's like the, reading Green Eggs and Ham on the Senate floor while you're trying to take health care away from 40 million people. There's stuff like that. There's the fact that he podcasts 3 times a week, which is a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Sitting United States senator.
Yeah.
But, when you had that little rolly bag when he's coming back from Cancun.
Oh, yes.
It's frustrating going through those little rope lines at any time. When you're going through it alone to explain why you abandoned your state during a statewide crisis, that was really embarrassing.
So they're referring to the time during a cold snap in Texas, Ted Cruz up and fled. He became known as Fled Cruz, and he was busted going to the airport to go to Cancun with his family. And he apparently went to Cancun and then came back immediately, left his family there after he got busted. And there was a huge scandal about it, saying, listen, I never intended to be gone that long. I was just going to go, make sure my wife and my kids got there, and I was going to turn around and fly back. And he was mocked relentlessly about it. Now, before I play the second part, which is the other scandal surrounding the other concern of Ted Cruz, which is this potential ethics scandal, I want to remind you that Ted Cruz is legendarily unlikable. And it's not just you and I saying that. It's also Ted Cruz's own colleagues. For example, another intensely unlikable Republican senator, Lindsey Graham. This is what he had to say about Ted Cruz.
A good Republican would defend Ted Cruz after tonight. That ain't happening. If you killed Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate, and the trial was in the Senate, nobody can convict you.
And again, that's coming from Lindsey Graham, again, himself an intensely unlikable and intensely disrespected Republican senator. You also have former Democratic Senator Al Franken, who had this to say about Cruz as well.
What about Ted Cruz? Ted Cruz makes up a big part of your...
Well, it makes up a chunk. Well, what I say is that I probably liked Ted Cruz more than most of my colleagues like Ted Cruz, and I hate Ted Cruz.
Again, that seems to be the consensus about Ted Cruz, that he is the least liked Republican senator. And when you consider the roster, the rogues gallery of Republican senators, that's a hell of an appellation. There's also the fact that, again, he never shuts up about his podcast, which is fine. I have a YouTube channel, but he is a sitting Republican senator. He's a sitting United States senator. You would think his priorities would be conserving his constituents. Of course, it's not exactly what Republicans do these days, but Ron Filipowski and Aaron Rupar constantly bust Ted Cruz's chops about this. He'll say nobody, not a soul, Ted Cruz. And then he will shamelessly plug his podcast, no matter what he's doing, where he is. He could be sitting at dinner asking his wife, hey, or his wife could say, hey, can you pass the salt? And he would say something like, yeah, I'm well known for passing the salt, like outside the dining room table, outside my podcast studio on my award-winning podcast show, The Verdict. I don't know if it's won awards, but I mean, that's what I'm saying, where he'll segue it in to any possible exchange between him and another human being. But speaking of the podcast, there's a potential ethics hubbub, brouhaha, scandal concerning his podcast and his PAC. So it was reported Ted Cruz is the top Republican on the committee in the Senate overseeing communications. Meanwhile, iHeartMedia, a registered lobbyist with business in front of the committee that Ted Cruz chairs, has paid, that he is the top Republican on, has paid his PAC $630,000 for hosting a podcast that they promote. Okay. And when Ted Cruz was asked about this, this is what he had to say.
So if an entity which employs lobbyists is giving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to your reelection efforts, how can you say you're not being compensated?
You know, it really is sad what's happened to the media, which is the media exists right now seemingly to parrot left-wing Democrat attacks. The group that brought that complaint, hold on a second, let me answer your question. You asked the question. I know you're not asking about it. The group that brought that attack is a left-wing Democrat attack group. And by the way, you know what you didn't mention in your question? The fact that they filed a complaint with the Senate Ethics Committee raising these same issues. You know what the Senate Ethics Committee did? They threw it out. They said it had no basis in law.
We'll get to that claim in a second. But again, note the posture. He gets defensive. He gets feisty. He's saying, oh, you're just part of left-wing media. He doesn't actually address the substance of the complaints. And then on top of that, he lied. So as was reported by Rolling Stone, the senator, unsurprisingly, was not being entirely truthful. While the Campaign Legal Center did raise an ethics complaint that was ultimately fruitless, the complaint had nothing to do with the payments that have come to light in recent weeks and focused on the legality of the podcast deal given iHeart's media status as a registered government lobbyist. Okay, so the bottom line is he lied. He deflected, he got defensive, and he lied. Standard Republican operating procedure. So listen, this is what Ted Cruz is having to deal with. Now, does that mean that he's going to lose his reelection bid? I don't know. I mean, he defied a lot of conventional wisdom and defeated Beto O'Rourke in 2018. The Republican governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, has taken steps to try to depress voter turnout by shrinking the number of ballot boxes, particularly, I believe, on college campuses, right? They want to depress that youth vote because obviously Ted Cruz is despised by America's youth and Texas's youth. So listen, I'm not taking anything for granted, but Allred is running a pretty good campaign. There's a sizable investment from the Democratic Party, and Ted Cruz is extraordinarily unlikable and unaccomplished for a Republican senator. I will say he's not stupid. Guy graduated from Harvard. He's litigated in front of the Supreme Court. He just does a hell of an impression of a useless idiot because that's what sells in the Republican Party. That's what's profitable. That's why he's transitioned into a full Trump MAGA cultist culture warrior. And I think we need to do him a favor. I think that we need to, since he podcasts 3 times a week, it's clearly his passion and good for him. Okay. We need to help him by relieving him of the burdens of being a part-time United States senator. And that's why I hope Ted Cruz loses re-election. But let me know what you think in the comments.